This video is about reactive extensions for JavaScript. And before we can really do anything cool with reactive extensions, we need to kind of have a very basic understanding of what it is. And so if I had to summarize what reactive extensions is, I would say this. Reactive extensions is a library that lets us consume declaratively composed sequences. Now I realize that that's not very helpful at this point, but what we're going to do in this video is two things. First, we're going to understand what exactly I just said. What the fuck did I just say? And secondly, we're going to understand how exactly reactive extensions lets us consume declaratively composed sequences. So let's dive into understanding this kind of cryptic phrase that I keep throwing around. And let's focus in specifically on what I mean by a sequence. Now, one thing I mean is simply an array. So an array is a sequence. However, not all sequences are arrays. Let me give you an example. Suppose I type the keys W, T, and F, and these are three keys that I just kind of type in. Now, these three keys are also a sequence in the way that I'm defining them. And although they're a sequence, right, these kind of three key presses, they don't all exist like in memory in some sort of array in JavaScript right now. And so they're a kind of asynchronous sequence. And we can imagine kind of capturing these key presses and putting them into an array. And then we would kind of have an array that's a sequence of asynchronous events that have kind of been captured. But it would be kind of an asynchronous sequence fundamentally. And so that's what we mean when we're talking about a sequence. We're just talking about kind of ordered data that might be kind of grabbed synchronously or asynchronously. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about sequences. Next, let's look at what it means to consume a sequence. And this is really easy. All I mean when I'm talking about consuming a sequence is just that you're doing something with that sequence. So here we have this list items sequence, which happens to be an array, and we're logging out that array to the console. So that's hopefully pretty simple. The next part is where things get a little complicated. So you should be familiar with the distinction between declarative code and imperative code. Declarative code is code that simply specifies what we want. It's code that says, I want this result. Whereas imperative code is concerned with specifying how exactly we accomplish a particular task. So let's look at an example of this. So the code that we see here is actually an imperative way of working with a sequence of countries. Ultimately, what we want here is to take the list of countries and to display that array of countries in a HTML list, and we only want a country to wind up in that HTML list if the name of that country is not the United States, because we happen to hate America, apparently. And so we can see here that this code is very concerned about kind of how we accomplish this. We're looping over countries, and we have this if statement that's checking to see if the country's name isn't equal to the United States, and then we're kind of building this string, this HTML string that we're eventually going to set as the inner HTML property on the search results element here at the bottom of the code. Now contrast this kind of imperative way of working with the sequence with this more declarative way that accomplishes the same task. So that's what we're looking at right here. And let's go ahead and kind of break down each line. So in the first line here, we're taking the countries and we're just filtering, we're saying filter on that countries, and I'm only interested in countries whose name is not the United States. And interestingly here, what we're doing is we're not saying how exactly to pick out all of the countries except for the ones whose name is the United States. We're not saying how to do that. We're not looping over anything, or we don't have an if statement. We're just saying what we want. What we want is to filter the list of the array of countries and to wind up with another array that does not contain any countries whose name is the United States. And we do the same thing here with this map method. Again, we're not looping over the array. We're just saying, well, I'm not really interested in countries. Really what I want is this HTML list item tag whose kind of inner body consists of the name of a particular country. And so just map, right? I'm saying what I want, just map from these countries to these kind of HTML list items. And then finally, we kind of, again, we're just declaratively saying what we want. We have this list of HTML list items, and we really just want to reduce that to a single string so that we can set that on the inner HTML property of the search results list. So you can see that there's kind of two fundamentally different approaches here. In the previous slide, we were working with code in an imperative way. We were specifying kind of how exactly to do things, whereas this code, it's more declarative. We're just saying what we want. Now the code is also functional. I'm sure some of you are thinking that, but the relevant distinction here is kind of the imperative versus declarative approaches to accomplishing this task. Now, the sequence here, this country sequence, has actually been kind of declaratively composed. We started off with a sequence of countries, and then when we called filter on that, we wound up with a sequence of countries minus any countries whose names is the United States. And so we just kind of declaratively called this method and wound up with a different sequence. And we did the same thing with map, where we mapped from countries to these HTML tag list item things. And again, we're kind of composing a sequence in this declarative way. So hopefully that's clear on what I mean when I talk about a declaratively composed sequence. And so hopefully when I say reactive extensions let us consume declaratively composed sequences, that's fairly clear. Now at this point you might be wondering, well, you just showed me how to consume a declaratively composed sequence just using standard JavaScript methods. So what exactly does reactive JavaScript or reactive extensions add to our ability to do this? And here's kind of my answer to that. So if you've ever searched for the phrase callback hell into Google, this is kind of the code that comes up. This is not something that you're supposed to just kind of understand by looking at it. And I want to suggest that the reason that we are stuck with callback hell in a lot of circumstances has to do with the fact that we don't have a way of working with asynchronous sequences in the same way that we have to work with synchronous sequences. In other words, although we can declaratively compose synchronous sequences, we can't do the same thing with asynchronous ones. So perhaps a better way of introducing reactive extensions is to say that it's a library that lets us consume declaratively composed, possibly asynchronous sequences. Now, it's okay if that still doesn't make a ton of sense to you. In the next video, we'll actually take a close look at how exactly reactive extensions lets us do this, and hopefully that'll shed a little bit more light on what this phrase means. And hopefully it'll also shed some light on how exactly reactive extensions can help us avoid callback hell.